Okay. This is an interview with Congressman John Lewis for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. Today's date is November 19th, 2005. Thank you, Congressman, for coming and sitting with us, and welcome to Birmingham.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted and very happy to be here in Birmingham.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be able to just sit with you today. Just let me talk just briefly, ask you briefly about your, you were born in Alabama, is that correct?
I was born in Alabama, about 10 miles outside of Troy. Troy is between Tuskegee and Montgomery. Yeah. I grew up there on a farm.
And how many children?
6 brothers. I had 6 brothers and 3 sisters. A lot of first cousins. My mother had 8 brothers and 1 sister. They had a lot of children. And so it was like a large, very large extended family.
Yes, right. Now, what about the education of your parents?
My mother attended the public schools in rural Pike County, Alabama, and she went to the 8th grade, and my father went to the 6th grade.
And what kind of work did they do?
They had been sharecroppers. My mother and father had been sharecroppers on the same land that my great-grandfather lived on and my grandfather. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. And I remember when we moved from this farm to the land that my father had bought, we had an old broken-down car, and in the back seat of the car was an old radio that operated on batteries, and a dog named Riley, and I was in the back seat.
Governor, it wasn't Governor Riley.
Well, that was later. That was the Governor Riley.
Yes. That background. How did you happen to get to Fisk University?
Well, when I was, as I was growing up, I kept hearing people say, "Get an education, get an education." And so you wouldn't have to work so hard like we do. And I wanted to get an education. And I had wonderful teachers in these schools. The elementary school was a short distance from my house, and we could walk down a hill and make it to the elementary school. But the middle school was several miles away, and we went on a bus. Bus past the white school. And then the high school was located in a little town called Brunswick. It was called Pike County Training School. During those days in Alabama, many of the rural high school was called, county high school was called training school. Right. And the white school was just called high school. And I had this wonderful teacher who was from Montgomery, and she would tell me, "Read, my child, read everything." And I read everything I could. And then in 1955, I heard about Rosa Parks, heard about Dr. King. I heard Dr. King's voice on the radio. And my first desire was to go to Morehouse because Dr. King had attended Morehouse. So when I finished high school in May of 1957, I applied. I sent an application to Troy State. I didn't tell my mother, didn't tell my father, any of my teachers. I had my transcript sent there. And I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Dr. King, and Dr. King invited me to come to Montgomery to see him. But in the meantime, I'd been accepted at a little college in Nashville called American Baptist Theological Seminary. It was a college of the Bible. So I went off there for 4 years. And after being there, I continued to study, and I got involved in the civil rights movement. And from being in Nashville, then I went to Fisk for 2 years and studied philosophy and religion.
At what point did you get actively involved with the movement while you were in Nashville?
Well, I met Dr. King in March of 1958 when I was 18 years old. He had invited me to come to Montgomery to see him. And when I was home for spring break, I went up by Greyhound bus from Troy to Montgomery, and arrived at the Greyhound bus station in downtown Montgomery. Fred Gray, who was a lawyer for Rosa Parks, for Dr. King and the Montgomery movement, met at the Greyhound bus station and drove me to the First Baptist Church on Ripley Street, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the office of the church, I guess the pastor's study. And I saw Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy standing behind the desk. I was so scared. I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Dr. King spoke up and said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Dr. King, I'm John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Dr. King. And so I went back to Nashville and continued to study there. And it was there that I first heard Rosa Parks. She would come and tell the story of the movement. Thurgood Marshall would come. Daisy Bates. Mrs. King would come and speak. And I would hear these folks coming to Nashville. Coretta Scott King would come and tell the story of the Montgomery bus boycott through songs. And they were so inspiring. And I wanted to find a way. And I went to a little church called the First Baptist Church in downtown Nashville, pastored by the Reverend Kelly Miller Smith, who was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr. They both had gone to Morehouse. Kelly Miller Smith was from Mount Bayou, Mississippi, but he was one of the great ministers. He could really preach and just tell a story. And many of the lawyers and doctors and professors from Fisk and Mahara Medical School and Tennessee State attended this church. And so one Sunday morning I was there, Kelly Miller Smith announced from the pulpit that a young minister by the name of Jim Lawson, will be conducting nonviolent workshops, and that people were welcome to come. And I started attending these nonviolent workshops at a little church near Fisk University campus every Tuesday night. A group of students from Fisk University, Mahara Medical School, American Baptist, Tennessee State, and Vanderbilt start studying the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. We studied the great religions of the world. We studied what Martin Luther King Jr. was all about in Montgomery. We studied Thoreau and civil disobedience, what Gandhi attempted to do in South Africa, what he accomplished in India. And we had what we call test sit-ins in November and December 1959. Before the sit-in started in Greensboro, North Carolina, we had test sit-in where a group of black and white students would go downtown to the large department store and try to be served. And we were told that blacks and white could not be served together. And
was Diane Nash a part of that group?
Diane Nash, Marion Barry, Bernard Lafayette, and several other young people. And we just went there to establish the fight that we couldn't be served. And we continued the nonviolent workshops. And after we came back from the Christmas holidays, we had planned to start sitting in on a regular basis. And then the sit-in started on February the 1st in Greensboro, North Carolina. And a young minister there called Jim Lawson and said, what can the students in Nashville do to be supportive of the students in North Carolina? And these two young Methodist ministers knew each other. And Jim told him, well, we've been conducting these nonviolent workshops. We had test sit-ins, and we were ready to start sitting in. And we started sitting in on a regular basis in Nashville. About 100, 500 and 600 students would come down. And especially on what we call T-days, Tuesday and Thursday, like class days, and on Saturday. And we would have from time to time 500 or 1,000 students gathering at a church to go downtown to sit in. And we'd be sitting there in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, waiting to be served. And someone would come up and spit on us, put a lighted cigarette out in our hair, down our backs, pull us off of the lunch counter stool, and beat us. And the Nashville sit-in movement became the first place where there was a mass arrest on February 27, 1960. 89 of us were arrested and taken to jail.
So Nashville then, of course, was in the forefront of the sit-in movement.
Well, it was because I think of the leadership of Jim Lawson and Keller Miller Smith. And Dr. King would come there to speak, to inspire and encourage people. And he would say things like the Nashville student movement is the most disciplined, is most organized, has a deep understanding of the philosophy of nonviolence. That was very inspiring to us. He would come to Fish University and speak in the gym. There'd be just hundreds and thousands of people trying to get in. And so we sort of reconnected, and I stayed in touch with him during that period.
Were you involved with the initial meeting where SNCC was organized at Shaw?
In Raleigh, North Carolina, Easter weekend, April 1960. I didn't go to Raleigh, but a delegation from Nashville, including Diane Nash, James Belver, and Brennan Lafayette, and Marion Barry, because it was at that meeting at Shaw University that Easter weekend that Marion was elected the temporary chair of the temporary student nonviolent coordinating committee. And then October of the same year, this group or similar group met on the Atlanta University campus, Willard Morehouse campus in Atlanta. And SNCC became a permanent organization, and I was at that meeting.
Now, SNCC went into Mississippi, and Howard Zinn called SNCC the new abolitionist in dealing with the whole question of voter registration. Can you just talk just a bit about that?
Well, in 1961, after the Freedom Ride, SNCC went into Mississippi. It was very dangerous. It was like putting your life on the line. For many of us, we went into Mississippi in May of 1961, my first trip to Mississippi. Growing up in Alabama, I thought Alabama was bad. But to cross that line and go into Mississippi, it was very dangerous. Because I saw what happened during the Freedom Ride. We arrived at the Greyhound bus station in Jackson. We were arrested, taken to the city jail, filled the city jail, later to the county jail. We filled the county jail. People kept coming. Then I put us in the state penitentiary at Parchman. I didn't know what.
How long were you in Parchman?
I stayed in Parchman for about 37 days in Parchman. I didn't know what was going to happen to us in Parchman, or whether we would ever get out of Parchman. Because the moment we arrived in Parchman, they brought a group of black and white freedom riders, men, on a big truck, and they brought the women in a van. And the moment we walked into this, what they call a maximum security unit, there was a guy standing there with his gun, his rifle drawn. And he said, sing your goddamn freedom songs now. We have niggers here that would beat you or eat you up. I didn't know what was going to happen. And they ordered us into a room and down a long hallway. They had all of the guys standing. And they ordered each one of us to take our clothing off. And for about a half an hour or longer, we stood there and knew no one had any clothing on. And then in twos, they led us to take showers. And if you had any facial hair, a beard, a mustache, you had to shave it off. And while you were there shaving, taking the shower, the guy still had the gun drawn on you. And after you finish your shower, then they led you in twos to a jail cell without any clothing. And then maybe an hour later, they come and give you a pair of Mississippi State Penitentiary, sort of greenish shorts and undershirt. And that's what we kept on during our entire stay there. You take a shower once a week. Couldn't read a book. A man from the Salvation Army came by and gave us the New Testament and the song. And I remember it so well. Brennan Lafayette wrote in my little Bible, my little New Testament, presented to John Robert Lewis, June 21st, 1961, by a man from the Salvation Army. That was Mississippi. And then that fall, the members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, fall of 61, in the spring of 62, started organizing in the heart of Mississippi, trying to get people registered to vote. The state of Mississippi in 1961, 1962, 3, 4, and 5 had a black voting age population of more than 450,000, but only about 16 or 18,000 blacks were registered to vote. There was so much fear. People were afraid. And they call us all the Freedom Riders. Like, here come the Freedom Riders. It was like Paul Revere coming. Here come the Freedom Riders.
In 1963, you became chair of SNCC. Tell me about that, how that evolved.
But I have been very active. After Diane Nash and James Belvoir and Bernard Lafayette left Nashville, I was still in Nashville as a student at FISC, but still active in the movement there, in the local movement. And I think after Marion Barry left as chair and another young man by the name of Chuck McDew, what we call the Central Committee of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, met in Atlanta and elected me the national chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in June of 1963. I moved to Atlanta at the age of 23. Mm-hmm. And 7 days later, I was invited, along with Martin Luther King Jr., A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young of the Urban League, James Farmer of CORE, Roy Wickham of the NAACP, and others from different other organizations at a meeting at the White House to meet with President Kennedy. And it was in that meeting that A. Philip Randolph said to President Kennedy that the masses are restless. He said the black masses are restless, and we're going to march on Washington. And you can tell by the very body language of President Kennedy, he didn't like what he heard. Mm-hmm. And he said, Mr. Randolph, or Brother Randolph, if you bring all these people to Washington, won't there be violence and disorder and chaos? And we would never get a civil rights bill through the Congress. Mr. Randolph responded and said, Mr. President, this will be an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent protest. And so after that meeting, we came out and had a few words with the media and said that we had a meaningful discussion with the president and we were going to have a march on Washington. And a few days later, to be exact, I think it was July 2nd, 1963, the 6 of us met in New York City and issued the call for the March on Washington and invited 4 major white religious and labor leaders to join us in issuing the call for the March on Washington.
During the March on Washington, that was read about when they were determining what you would say. And you had, I guess you had developed, the younger folk had developed a statement. And A. Philip Randolph thought it didn't meet his approval. Tell me about that and how that evolved.
Well, we all, the 6 black leaders, heads of organization, plus the 4 white heads of organization, all had to prepare statements and to make them available the night before the March on Washington. Julian Bond, who was very much a part of the Atlanta student movement, was the communication director for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he had got advanced copies of my prepared speech and made it available to the media. And so it got out, and other people saw it. And there were some things in this speech that people didn't like. We all were staying at the Hilton Hotel at 16th and K, and someone knocked on my door that night before the march. And it was Baird Rustin. And Baird Rustin said, John, come downstairs to a meeting. There's some problem with your speech. And I went down for this meeting with other people from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Walter Reuther from UAW, somebody representing Martin Luther King. I think it was Walter Fauntleroy, someone representing Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and James Farmer. And people had some problem. One part of the speech says something like, in good conscience, we cannot support the administration's civil rights bill. for it was too little and it was too late. And I went on to say there's not anything in this bill that will protect old women and young children involved in peaceful, nonviolent protests run down by policemen on horseback and chased by police dogs or something like that. Then down in the bottom of the speech, I said something like, we're involved in a serious revolution. Listen, Mr. President, you're trying to take the revolution out of the streets and put it in the courts. And when there was a lot of rhetoric saying, you tell us to wait, you tell us to be patient. We cannot wait. We cannot be patient. We want our freedom and we want it now. And at one point, Byron said to me, he was sort of joking. He said, John, saying we cannot be patient, that may be offensive to the Catholic Church. People believe in being patient. The Archbishop of the Diocese of Washington, Archbishop O'Ball, had threatened not to give the invocation if I kept a speech. So that was sort of the beginning. And I think Walter Reuther and some people in the Kennedy administration, some people think it was Bobby Kennedy, who had got to the Archbishop and was putting pressure on him to say to A. Philip Randolph and to Dr. King that John Lewis must change his speech. But what they really were troubled with, I said something like, the party of Kennedy is the party of Eastland, the late senator of Mississippi, who owned a plantation and treated black people in Mississippi like they were not even human. And I also said that the party of Rockefeller, is the party of Goldwater, in reference to the conservative senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. And then I said, where's our party? Where is our party? And I raised a question. I wanted to know which side is the federal government on. But then before I ended the speech, early, while I was working on the speech, I read a copy of the New York Times a few days early. I saw a group of black women in Southern Africa carrying signs saying, one man, one vote. So in my prepared text, I said something like, one man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours. That became the rallying cry for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But at the end of the speech, I said something like, if we do not see meaningful progress here today, the day may come when we will not confine our marching on Washington, but we may be forced to march through the South the way Sherman did, nonviolently. And they objected to that. They thought it was too inflammatory, thought I was calling for violence. So we made the other changes. But the next day, even as the march started, all of us had gone up to Capitol Hill, met with the congressional leaders. We had marched to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And Mr. Randolph and Dr. King said, John, there's still a problem with this speech. So we met to the right side of Mr. Lincoln, away from the march, the platform. And we started going through the speech. And James Foreman, the executive director of SNCC, a young man by the name of Cortland Cox, who was had been a student at Howard, but very active. The three of us are conferring with A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Dr. King. And at one point, Mr. Wilkins said, we really got to change the genre. And so I sort of said, this is my speech. This is a speech of those of us from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they reflect the feeling and the attitude of the people that we've been working with. And another point, Dr. King said, John, that doesn't sound like you. And then Mr. Randolph said something like, John, we come this far together. We come this far together for the sake of unity, for the sake of staying together. Can we make these changes? In reference to Sherman. But there were some people who wanted me to delete the word revolution, delete the phrase black mouses. And A. Philip Randolph came to my rescue and he said, there's nothing wrong with the use of the word revolution. I use it myself sometime. There's nothing wrong with black mouses. I use that also. So we decided to delete any reference to Sherman And I sort of said, if we do not see meaningful progress here today, the day may come we will march to certain cities, and I called Birmingham and Atlanta, maybe, and Philadelphia, and Harlem, and different places.
In 1977, President Carter appointed you to action. Can you talk about what action was and what it represented?
Well, in 1977, when I was appointed as the domestic director for the Action Agency, it was the umbrella for several anti-poverty type programs. Hundreds and thousands of volunteers, older American volunteers, something we call foster grandparents. But it's also VISTA volunteers. VISTA volunteers, people go in and work in low-income neighborhoods and areas. It was, in a sense, the domestic Peace Corps, trying to help alleviate poverty, using the resources and skills of young people as well as senior citizens.
In 81, you were elected to the Atlanta City Council.
Well, in 1980, I went back to Atlanta, left Washington, went back to Atlanta, and decided to run for a city council seat. And I remember having a discussion with Daddy King, the father of Martin Luther King Jr., because he was my pastor. And he said to me, John, you cannot defeat this man. His family owned a beauty barber supply. They come to our weddings and our funerals. You just cannot defeat him. But if you decide to run, we're going to support you. So I got out there in 1981, ran citywide, had a wonderful group of young people, a lot of students, and campaigned all over the city and got 69.8% of the vote. I seated a guy who had been on the city council for 24 years.
You know, Congressman, I often wonder, and I don't know that you can answer this, but in Atlanta, people who were actively involved with the movement became politically active there and were elected to offices. Birmingham, that didn't happen. And, you know, we're still discussing that, you know, well, why in Atlanta and not in Birmingham? But that's an issue that we'll deal with at another time. But I just wanted to throw that out. But in 86, you then was elected to Congress, the 5th District of Georgia. Tell me about that.
Well, in 1985, the fall of 85, I have just been reelected as a member of the Atlanta City Council. And a few days later, the young man by the name of White Fowler, who was holding the congressional seat, informed me that he was going to run for the Senate and give up the seat. And I made up in my mind then that I was going to run for that congressional seat. And so I called Julian, or Julian called me. Somehow we made a decision to have lunch together. Julian had been in the State House for 10 years and 10 years in the State Senate. And so we went to lunch because I knew he was interested in running for the seat and I was interested in running for the seat. And we have been good friends, very close, wonderful friends. And at this lunch, I said something like, Senator, what are you going to do? He said, I'm running for Congress. And he called me Mr. Chairman. He always called me Mr. Chairman since I had been the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He said, Mr. Chairman, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to run for Congress. I guess I'll see you on the campaign trail. That was the shortest lunch we ever had together. That was the most difficult campaign, probably the most difficult thing ever done in my life, really. It was much more difficult to run for Congress with someone that you love and struggle with and fought with. Much more difficult than walking across the bridge in Selma. And we got out there. He wanted to go to Congress. I wanted to go. It was probably the most publicized congressional campaign of 1986 during that that year. It was hard. It was very tough. It was several of us running in the primary, but I knew Julian is very good. He is very, very good. He was well known. He was born in Nashville, but he was almost a native of Atlanta. He had been in Georgia politics for more than 20 years. So I got out there and I had to become known. I was better known in Alabama, probably, better known in Mississippi, and probably in South Georgia than in Atlanta. Because a lot of my work was not necessarily in Atlanta, it was other part of the South, other parts of the country. So I got out there and I worked night and day, sometimes 24 hours. And I kept saying during the campaign, send to Washington a workhorse, not a show horse. I kept saying, send to Washington a tugboat, not a showboat. It was not necessarily a reference to Julian, but there was a lot of people running at the time. And then in the primary, it came down to the two of us. And we had a runoff. But early Julian received 47% of the vote, almost won it without a runoff. I got only 35% of the vote. 3 weeks later, I went up 17 points. He went up 1 point. I knew if it came down to 1-on-1 that I would outwork him. And the voters saw they saw me working and they turned toward me. It was a powerful coalition that came together, and I haven't had a tough race since. It was very difficult, very hard. And for a while, there was a schism that existed between us, but now we're bike friends and buddies.
Yeah, well, that was a question I was going to ask. How long did that schism last?
It took some time. It took some time, but it's over.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. What do you see as the key issues facing you in Congress and this nation at this point?
At this point, I think the nation, those of us in the Congress and the American people, got to find a way to bring the madness to an end. We got to stop the violence, this war. It is tampering really with the very soul of America. Sometimes I feel like we've lost our sense of direction, our sense of purpose. This was an unnecessary war. And it makes me so sad when I hear that another group of people have been killed in Iraq. Not just our own men and women, but the innocent citizens there. I think there's more terrorism now. There's a greater degree of violence because of what we've done. And my greatest fear, if this war continues much longer, that there will be a generation of young people growing up in the Middle East, and they will hate generations of Americans for years to come. We got to find a way to end it, bring the people home, and try to reconnect with our allies and make the world a little more peaceful.
Do you see that happening in the near future?
I think it will happen. I think it will happen in the near future because all of the surveys, all of the polling data are saying that the American people are sick. They're sick and tired of this war. They're saying that there's no justification for it. They believe, like so many of us in the Congress believe, that we was misled. Many of us, the great majority of the Democrats, but especially the great majority of African-American members of Congress didn't vote to go to war. And in addition, we got to do something at home about seeing that all of our young people get the best possible education. We got to see that all of our citizens have access to good health care. I believe that health care is a human right and that the quality of a person's health care shouldn't be decided on the basis of the size of that person's wallet or the zip code that that person lives in. And we got to rebuild, we got to spend the necessary dollars to rebuild the Gulf Coast, including New Orleans. We got to rebuild places in Mississippi and Alabama. We can rebuild Europe after World War II, and we're spending billions of dollars to help build Baghdad and other parts of Iraq after we have destroyed it. We got to not just build the physical structure of these places, but we got to help rebuild the lives of people.
One final question. There's this continuing discussion about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 expiring in 2007. Can you give us your take on that issue?
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is still the most powerful, nonviolent, and perhaps one of the most progressive pieces of legislation that we've had probably for many, many years, because it not only liberated blacks, but it helped to liberate whites also. And one thing about white politicians, especially those in the South, they can count. And they see all these black people get registered and voting. Then they have to make some special efforts to see that people get services and that they be responsive to the needs of these people. There are people today who would like to let those section of the Voting Rights Act that go and expire in 07, they would like to see them die. There's a section called Section 5. It deals with the whole question, if in the city of Birmingham or Atlanta or Montgomery or New Orleans or Jackson, Mississippi, decided to change location of precincts or decided to change from at-large election to single-member district to gerrymander in a way, they have to get approval from the voting rights section of the Department of Justice. Those of us in the Congressional Black Caucus and the majority of members of the Congress, I think, take the position that the Voting Rights Act and those sections, Section 5 and others, were good and necessary in 65, they're good and necessary now. If we don't renew it and extend it, there's a real possibility that we can go back. You can use Georgia as a simple example. The state legislature in Georgia, the first part of 2005, passed a piece of legislation saying that you must have a state official, an official state photo ID to be able to vote. Mm-hmm. Now, in many parts of Georgia, to get a state ID, it could cost $25 or $30. So some of us call that a modern-day poll tax. Mm-hmm. You can have a driving license. But there are many people, 80 and 90 years old, or 75 years old, without a driving license. And if you're a student at Georgia Tech, or Georgia State, or the University of Georgia, you can use your student ID because these are state schools. But if you're a student at Morehouse, or Spelman, or Clark, Atlanta University, Emory, these are private schools. So your student ID wouldn't count. Mm-hmm. So there's an extra burden. So in order for something like that to be disapproved or approved, we need Section 5 to say to the state of Georgia that is wrong. And what we just had happen in Georgia, the career attorneys in the Department of Justice said this is wrong, it shouldn't happen. It violates the Voting Rights Act, the spirit and the letter of the Voting Rights Act. These are 4 out of the 5 career attorneys in the Department of Justice. But then the political attorneys came in, appointed by President Bush. They said, oh, no, it's okay. And so that is all coming out. And then the other section that is scheduled to expire, Section 203, deal with the whole question of language. If you speak Spanish, if you want to know Spanish, maybe some Eastern European language or some Native American language, then we're saying that the voter registration form and the ballot should be in those languages. And some people say those sections should expire. But if you want everybody who are citizen and are registered, they should be able to participate. So you keep Section 5 and you keep the language section also. And I think when the Congress debated later this year or early 2006, we will renew and extend the Voting Rights Act. No one, unless they just come from another planet, want to be on the wrong side of this issue because it is a powerful political issue. We cannot go back. We cannot stand still. We got to continue to open up the political process and let all of our citizens come in, including the new immigrants, whether they are from Central and South America, whether they're from Haiti or from Africa, from Eastern Europe, whether they're the people who've been living here all the time, but is not fluent in English.
Congressman, I want to thank you for taking time out. And again, we welcome you to Birmingham, and we're looking forward to being with you this evening.
Well, thank you very much, sir. I'm delighted and very pleased to be in Birmingham. I always enjoy coming here, and especially coming to the Civil Rights Institute.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.